afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's lecture, we are going to talk about Buddhism, and this is part of the series on sociology of religion. As we discussed in the previous lecture, that Buddhism is not necessarily a conventional religion. It is rather a philosophy that tells us about a way of life. Now, if as philosophy, as an app, we see that it's telling us a way of life, then there could be multiple understanding of how we lead a life. And therefore, it is understood that it is more of an intellectual abstraction. In reality, there is no one Buddhism, but many Buddhism. So it is an understanding that its origin is started off in India sometime in the 4th, 5th century BC, and its teaching and institution flourished in the 15th century. During the initial period, Buddhism spread through trade route far into Asia, Afghanistan and Japan. By 12th century, Buddhist institution had disappeared from proper India, and it got more in terms of countries which were outside. So there was a kind of a decline towards 12th century BC, and it spread to the neighboring countries of India. Now, before we kind of understand this religious abstracting or the philosophy of it, we need to understand that the term Buddhist refers to a vast, complex religious and philosophical tradition with a history that stretches over 2,500 years. So, this is a long history, and yes, obviously, over this period, a lot of changes has happened, and there's kind of a lot of schools within it which has emerged. So, it cannot be kind of understood as one tradition or one particular way of understanding it. There are a lot of research scholars who have translated the text written in Pali language to English and made an attempt to understand the ideas and teaching of Buddhism. Buddhism is practiced in Asia, Afghanistan, Persia, Japan, Mongolia and Russia. So when we look into the living Buddhism, it can be divided into three broad traditions. The Theravada tradition of Sri Lanka and South Asia, and this is also known as Southern Buddhism because it is more or less prevailing in the southern part. East Asian tradition of China, Korea, Japan and Vietnam, and because of the regional area that this tradition is more prevalent, it is referred to as Eastern Buddhism. And then the Northern Buddhism, which is the Tibetan, Nepal, Tibet is the area where it is found. Now, the Theravada tradition, its canonical tradition is preserved in Pali, which is an ancient language very closely related to Sanskrit, and much of the text related to Buddha and his teaching was in Pali language. These schools exemplify conservatism in comparison to the Eastern and the Northern Buddhism. And in doctrine and it's kind of more conserving the tradition or the teaching of Lord Buddha, and it is kind of more similar to the original Buddhism. It is practiced in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and it kind of has a very large followers, of more than 100 million people. And they are kind of the Theravada tradition represents the Hinayana or the lesser vehicle. East Asian tradition is the Eastern Buddhism, and it is practiced in China, Korea and Vietnam. Its scriptures are preserved in Chinese language, and its general outlook is that of the Mahayana or the Great Vehicle. East Asian Buddhism is extremely diverse. It coexisted with several other ideologies like Confucianism, Taoism, Shinto and also communism. It remains a significant religious tradition for 500 to 1,000 million population. The third, the Tibetan tradition, its scripture is preserved in Tibetan and its broader outlook is similar to the Mahayana, but its more specific orientation is that of the vehicle of the diamond. So Mahayana is the greater vehicle, the Tibetan tradition is the vehicle of the diamond, thunderbolt, and also known as Tantric Buddhism. It is followed by 10 to 20 million people in Tibet, Mongolia, parts of Nepal and Himalayan India. The Tibetan tradition structures the story of Buddha's life around the 12th act performed by all Buddhas, and we there's certain kind of act which we have to keep in mind in terms of restricting our everyday activity and leading a life of a Buddha. So we trying to understand what means by the term Buddha. The word Buddha is not a name but a title. Its meaning is one who has woken up or one who is enlightened. The title is applied by the Buddhist tradition to a class of beings who are from the perspective of ordinary humanity extremely rare and quite extraordinary. In contrast to the Buddha or the awakened one, the mass of the humanity along with other creatures that constitute the world as asleep. So you have divide the population into two kinds. One is the Buddha, who is the awakened one who is not always sleepy or lazy, versus the larger mass who are always asleep. That is, they have not been able to understand their life. So the ordinary mass lives the life without knowing and seeing the world as it is resulting in suffering. So because of being lazy or because of being unaware, ignorant, not having made an effort, there will be a lot of suffering in life. So you can easily identify who in a population could be the awakened one. Those who are more hardworking, who want to bring about a change in their life. And how do they do it? Not by deceiving other or stealing or immoral action, but through the right way of laboring and earning. So a Buddha compared to the sleepy is always in quest of knowledge of the world, and he the moment he or she is able to understand, have knowledge of the problem, will be able to come out from the suffering. The greatest significance of Buddha to the rest of the humanity is that a Buddha is always a teacher. He teaches out of sympathy and compassion for the suffering of being, for the benefit and welfare of one being. So you become a Bodhisattva. You've got enlightenment or nirvana, and you start enabling others to take the same path. So the Buddha teaches in order to lead others to awaken to the understanding that brings relief from suffering. So when we look into the idea of the Buddha, what comes close to our mind is the renouncer tradition. So Buddhist sources of idea, because there's a lot of conflict over the exact historical period which could be identified as belonging to the origin of Buddhism or to the life of Buddha. So there are two kind of sources. One is the Buddhist source, which dates back to 4th or 3rd BC, and then the second is the non-Buddhist sources, which are Jain and Brahminical tradition. And in this tradition, there is no mention of Buddha, but it presents Buddha as Shramana. So there is a a historical difference in which the data is being presented. So the term means the Shravana term means one who strives religiously or spiritually, the sense of all religious tradition in India. So whether it be any religion, the idea is to work towards spirituality, and spirituality means inner happiness. So any quest for understanding or arriving at a historical Buddha must begin with the Shramana tradition, and it is also called the renouncer or the sannyasi tradition. So how do we understand the philosophy of Buddhism is to begin with an understanding of what is the renouncer tradition, or how do we understand who is a sannyasi and how does it lead the individual towards the path of enlightenment. The Buddha and the renouncer tradition is making reference to any individual who is able to renounce the normal life in a society as a member of extended household, in order to devote themselves to some form of religious or spiritual life. So it's kind of two kind of life again. One is your spiritual religious life versus your everyday mundane life, which is economic, marriage, sexual relation. So you need to kind of be able to renounce one in order to attain the other. So you renounce your everyday mundane life and move towards spirituality. So the renouncer abandons conventional means of livelihood and adopts a religious life as means of livelihood. So what you will kind of also do is give up your profession or the work that you do, and you start doing meditation, and you become a religious mendicant dependent on alms. That is, you would kind of ask for the everyday requirement from others. So you move from household to a life of homelessness. So you give up your everyday comfort. You are able to kind of come out of that everyday comfort. And this phenomena of renouncing economic means of livelihood and adopting a religious one was kind of prevalent in India as late back as 15th century BC. So that is why it's 15th century BC is kind of considered as the period when it is going to begin. There are different kinds of renouncer, as we will understand. The first is wanderer. A wanderer would be a person who would be always on the mobile. It would be mobility, would be moving from one place to the other. And that would also say that you are not fixed to a particular occupation or to a particular area. You move around in search of knowledge. So you are kind of looking for certain knowledge. You won't get it fixed at one point. You have to move to different places. The regional term is parivajaka and paribhajakra. The second type of renouncer is one who begs his say. So you're going to kind of ensure your everyday life through begging. And it was kind of not considered derogatory as we would do it today, but it was kind of people would give out to the people who were sage or ascetics out of the idea of charity, out of the idea of sharing. So if you are in search of knowledge for the truth, then you have to kind of focus on meditations and spirituality. You have given your everyday economic life, so you have to kind of depend on others to share everyday need. So those who are begging their says are bhikshu or bhikkhu. Then the third type is the naked ascetic, akela, and the fourth is mated hair ascetic or the jatila. So you are not even kind of entering into your doing a everyday mundane task of combing your hair, and it's kind of left. The only work that is the renouncer does is to meditate, and therefore it is kind of a step towards moving for enlightenment. Some of the ascetics are loners, so they kind of leave their family life and they kind of take up residence in some forest area or on the Himalayas. But some of them are also organized, that is, they form a group and they live together. And so you have a sangha or you have a place where all of them are meditating and you are doing it under a teacher. Initially, it was mainly men who were becoming renouncers, but with the growth of Buddhism and Jainism, many women are also taking on the path of becoming renouncers. So what are the renouncers doing? What do they do in their everyday life? The first activity of the renouncer is practice of austerities. That is, you are going to bear the burden, the physical weather. You're not going to be affected by cold, wind or sun. So you're going to take on all the physical discomfort, and therefore fasting, a lot of kind of focus on only letting the mind work. So it's kind of complete abstaining from the everyday mundane luxurious life. The second is to cultivate a meditative and contemplative technique aimed at producing an altered state of consciousness. So you are going to kind of ensure that your mind is calm, your mind is able to sync the information that is around you. And how are you going to do it? It is you have to alter your state of consciousness. So you are not going to be conscious about what you are wearing, what you are eating, what will others speak about it, but you need to kind of concentrate only on seeking knowledge. The third is attainment of such a state consciousness was regarded as bringing the practitioner to deep knowledge and experience of the nature of the world. So you through concentration, through kind of meditation, going to only be aware of informations which is going to enable you to have a good grasp of the reality around you. The development of philosophical view. So the fourth activity is that you start kind of thinking philosophically. You start giving an intellectual justification for any kind of activities that's happening around, and every action or any kind of reality can be explained through theoretical knowledge. So when we have this whole idea of renouncer tradition in India, it also helps us to understand that it is having its similarity to the Brahminical tradition. And the Brahminical tradition, if we go into the history of Brahmana, is kind of 2nd millennium BC, and this is the time when a tribal nomadic group entered India through the plains of Indus Valley. They settled down in the Indus Valley and they spoke the dialect of Indo-Aryan, that is the Sanskrit language. Now these Aryas considered themselves descendant of nomadic pastoralists who had occupied the grassland of Central Asia. Now once they settled in the Indus Valley, they started having cultural influence, and their lifestyle, their culture started spreading to southward and eastward to other parts of northern India. By 5th century BC, and this is the time when Buddhism kind of emerges in India, the Aryan had already been in India for thousands of years, and their cultural influence spread as far as Patliputra, which is now modern Patna. So it was kind of influenced by the Brahminical tradition. If we look into the vision of the Arya society, they was based on the stratified and dividing the society into hierarchy, which is also the Aryan theory of the origin of caste system, which is the distinction between the Aryas and the non-Aryas. The Aryas kind of considered themselves as the Brahman, or what you call Brahmin. So we kind of is taking it from the Brahmanas, which is their understanding of the Aryas. And the original literature of the Brahmins are known as the Vedas. The oldest Veda is the Rig Veda, which is dated from 1500 BC. By the time Buddha comes in and the Vedic literature, it gets kind of classified into different types of literature which was prevalent there. The first is the 4 collection or the Samhita, and this is kind of attributed to the Asian seers. The second is ritual manual, also known as the Brahmanas, giving instructions in the carrying out of elaborate sacrificial ritual. Now these rituals were belonged to the Aryas, and therefore they kind of ranked themselves higher in the stratification. The third category of the literature which tells us about the vision of the Brahminical tradition is the forest book or the Aryanaka, and they were giving us the historical meaning of sacrificial rituals. The fourth category of literature is the Upanishad, which contains again a detailed explanation of the Sanskritic sacrificial rituals which the Aryas followed. And all of these texts provides the vision of the society as perceived by the Aryas. And if we kind of look into the vision of the society, it was basically an occupational division of the society into the fourfold varna, which is again a part of understanding the caste system in India, which we will not do here because we're trying to understand Buddhism. So let's go back to Buddha and the history. The precise date of Buddha's life is uncertain because of the multiple kind of understanding of how it is kind of which period can be attributed to it, but most of the literature, they kind of confirm this idea that it was around the 4th to 5th BC. These dates are arrived by following tradition recorded in Pali sources of southern Buddhism, and it's being referred, the reference point is to the Asoka. So because he had kind of converted to Buddhism, the historical data take us very close to it, and the reference is to two kind of data from history. One is that Asoka was consecrated 219 years after the death of Buddha, and the second historical date is that 268 BC is the year for the assassination of Asoka. So source of this information is the Asoka rock edict, but these dates are contested and there is no precise date which can kind of confirm which is correct. But we place it to the 4th and 5th BC. So when we look into Buddhism and we kind of understand it, that it is the lessons and teaching of life of Buddha, so let us go into the biography of who was this individual who was given the title of Buddha. So most of us are aware of the fact that Buddha was born as Siddharth Gautam and was the son of the local chieftain, a Rajan, in Kapilavastu, and this area is now in Nepal, India border. Siddharth Gautam was the son of a royal local chieftain, so he belonged to the aristocratic family. He was born into a wealthy and privileged family. So while he was growing up, he enjoyed all the privileges of life. He was kind of having all the comfort of life. But somehow he was disillusioned. He was not very satisfied with this, and therefore he kind of decides to leave the house and go out. When he kind of moves out from the comfort zone, he sees he feels a sense of suffering, and the suffering was in the form of sick man and old man and death. So these important event of life, that is suffering, death, age, disturbed him so much that he started kind of trying to understand the meaning of pleasure, and he start kind of questioning that why certain people are able to get pleasure and why this suffering is essential. So he becomes an ascetic, and he kind of becomes a wandering ascetic, a Sramana, and starts kind of embark on religious and spiritual quest. He took instructions from various teachers, practiced extreme austerities, and when he was still dissatisfied, he sat for meditation under the Bodhi tree, and after several long period of meditation, he achieved enlightenment or an awakening and a deep understanding of the suffering. Now, once he has been able to achieve this enlightenment and understand what causes suffering and how we can come out of the suffering, he starts teaching this to others. So he spent his life teaching ways to kind cessation of suffering, that is how to bring about end of suffering. And in the course of wandering across, he moved around from one place to the other. He gathered a considerable followers. By the time of his death, he had a huge follower, and they established a well-organized community. So his followers cremated his body and divided the relics which were enshrined in a number of stupa. So the story of Buddha is not just of an individual, but about the story of those who want to find the way to religious truth. So, if we look into the sources of the how we understand the life of Buddha, the legend of Buddha, there are several sources. The first is the classical, literally Sanskritic text, Mahavastu, which is the great story from 1st century BC. The second is Lalita Vistra, which is graceful description, again written in the 1st century. Then third is the Asvaghosa poems, which the Buddha Charitra or the life of the Buddha, which was written in 2nd century BC. Pali Nidhakantha, which is the introductory tale written in the 2nd and 3rd century, and the Jataka, which is a collection of stories of Buddha's previous life. In order to understand Buddhism, we need to kind of try to understand the life of Buddha, what led him to move out and ensure that he gets understanding. So basically, it's kind of very different sources of literature that we can use. But for the literature, for the lecture today, I have referred to the text by Rupert Gethin, and the name of the book is The Foundation of Buddhism, which is an Oxford University Press and published in New York. So if we read this book, it's an elaborate text going into all the details of the life of Buddha and his teaching. We will have a good understanding of Buddhism. With this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.